everyone. I'm back. I'm Snehal. Let me introduce you. Joy Spinner is an accredited Kanban trainer and consultant with Kanban University, currently holding the position of Vice President for Community Development and Product Management. Joey has 25 plus years of experience and skilled in coaching, training, and agile methodologies, software development, and project management. He is a strong community and social services professional with trained focus in workforce development and training. Over to you, Joey.
Okay, thanks so much, Chanel. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining me today. So I'm going to share a few things with you guys in terms of how we look at evolutionary change. So I'll be paying attention to the Q&A, by the way, throughout this whole thing. So if you guys have questions along the way, feel free to pop them in. I'll try to answer them real time if I can, or maybe right at the end of the presentation here. So thanks again for all of you joining. I'm going to get started here and get into a little bit on, again, introducing evolutionary change. So one of the things that I wanted to know about today, and you guys can put this, I believe, into the Q&A or possibly the chat, if you can possibly. Let's see how this works, which is a big question, and it may be a reflective question in the end, which is, what does your Scrum look like today? Is it, great, going well, or is it somewhat having some challenges? And I'm using Scrum as a reference point for evolutionary change, by the way, folks. We'll talk more about this here as we dive into it. But if you can answer in the chat or in the Q&A area, that would be great for me to kind of see who's showing up here today. Have you got no problems in your Scrum, or do you have some challenges here that you're trying to resolve? I'll give you guys a few seconds here. All right, so it looks like folks may be typing stuff, maybe not. That's all right if you're not. We can move forward with this. Okay, looks like folks are sitting there at the screens, soaking up what we have to share here today. So I wanted to share a few things with you guys in terms of challenges that I've seen that bring about effectively the need for evolutionary change. So there's two key things here. One is improving flow predictability. So in a lot of organizations and where you're working right now, there's probably a desire or a need to say, how do we keep things running smoothly? How do we get things predictable to a certain level or a certain degree? Some of you guys might be uber geeks in this space. You may already know about predictability. If you do, hang around for the fun part of how do you actually get predictability going inside your environment. So some of this may sound familiar to you. If not, let's dive in. The other challenge that I see as well is this piece, which is how do we handle resistance to change? So the guy on the left, it may be you or someone you know, right? And they're kind of trying to figure out how to get a change done in their environment. They tend to struggle quite a bit. On the right side is the struggle, actually. It's the fellow developer who's got so much on their plate already. They've already got a lot going on. And you're trying to introduce a change to them. And sometimes it's hard for them to embrace it. They may not feel like they're involved. They may not feel like they're getting what they need out of this experience. So that's a key challenge that we see, along with the flow and predictability. Those are two common problems that kind of instigate a need for saying, let's try to change somehow. But how to change is awfully tricky. So going back to flow for just a second, and kind of diving in there a little bit more, one of the things that we've discovered here over the past 10 years or so at Kanban University is something along the lines of understanding what's going on in your flow, kind of missing some things that are really what we call low-hanging fruit. And an example that we see sometimes in the field, not always, right, but sometimes it shows up, is that people tend to kind of overload a given thing in their environment. For example, a user story. Suddenly, everything becomes a user story because it's just convenient to track it that way. I would love to see you guys in the room and see you raise your hands. How many of you actually have that happening now? Where you're using something like a platform like Atlassian or something else, and you're just kind of overloading that user story with things in it. And my joke here on the right is basically that someone says, well, wait a minute, we're doing more than just user stories. We do these things. And the person who's actually managing all of it goes, no, we just track everything in user stories. So here's some examples of what you might find hiding underneath your user stories. You might find things like production issues, bugs, features, maybe tech that are kind of all baked into what is known as a type of work called a user story inside a system. And that's just for convenience purposes only. Some of you may actually already be tracking these things. If you are tracking like features and bug fixes and production issues and tech debt, that's superb. That's really good. That's not always the case for some firms and some people and where they work. I just spoke with two folks here, and they were saying that they work for a company at an airport, basically. And I'm sure in some ways that company dictates how they're going to track their work. So this is kind of interesting space to hang out in, because when you get that kind of requirement put in front of you, it becomes tricky for how to manage the flow effectively. No matter what tool you're using, it's going to be kind of tricky at times. So let's dive into this a little bit further. When you're exploring that, when you're kind of digging into that type of work, a user story, for example, you're probably going to find some stories around performance. I imagine some of you guys already have some information around things like what might be described as cycle time or lead time or other kind of measurements of time for how long it takes work to get through your environment. And that's always a good signal right there. That's always a good sign to track that kind of information, because it starts to tell you stories around how long it takes to work to get done. But in addition to that, there's also things that talk about delay or dependencies. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are struggling with dependencies sometimes, trying to figure out how do you plan for them, how do you manage for them? Because in some cases, ideally, you want to try to remove them, but in reality, they're probably going to stay there for quite a while. So the question becomes, how do you manage a dependency with you? How do you manage a delay? How do you get those things reduced in terms of impact on the time it takes to get work done? So when it comes to pulling through and kind of poking through some of these user stories or other things that you're tracking in your system, they're probably going to create a little bit of a story themselves about how long it takes work to get done, a certain kind of work, right? Now, with that comes the ability to focus. So if we start to understand what type of work is there and what attention is needed for it, we can probably deliver that with greater predictability and better quality. So you might find, for example, that database work is something that's popping up commonly in your user stories. You need that kind of thing done on a somewhat frequent basis. And it's the thing that's taking the most time. And so you might say, we're going to do 4 or 5, maybe 10 user stories with so many points or whatever you're going to use to measure that commitment with. And what comes out of it is, wow, we just put all of our bets or all of our commitment against 4 or 5, maybe more database related user stories. And we know the database is going to take the most time. So now we're kind of stuck in a place where we're requiring a lot of the database type individuals or the database team, whoever that might be. And now we're running into problems with dependencies or delays associated with that. So if we can start to focus on that and realize that we might want to balance how much we're committing there, then we actually get a little bit better predictability, maybe a little bit better quality as a result of that focus. So that's another key thing that you can explore, is how do you start to balance that out with your level of commitment? Now, with that comes the need to change how you're working, right? You're going to set up something almost like what we call policies here in the Kanban method. So something along the lines of, hey, let's make sure that if we commit to something, that we're not overcommitting to it. So let's just say, let's commit to only 2 or 3 user stories that have database related work associated with them. That way, we know we're probably going to have some delays associated with that, but we can manage those delays as best as we can. And there are ways to do that beyond what I'm sharing with you today, but that's the beginning part of it, to say we can commit to only so much, and that way we can actually successfully deliver on those things and get other work done as well. That way we're not imbalancing ourselves. So that's another key thing to be thinking about here when we're exploring things like user stories. For example, this could be your bugs, this could be your features. It just depends on what's in your environment and how you kind of catalog and name things. But there's an interesting piece to this that I think is really fun to play with. This is where I get excited in terms of the Kanban world, which is actually kind of looking at the workflow for the type of work. So you've got a type of work right now known as user story, which is what we've been talking about. And every organization I've worked with has a kind of a different workflow, but I found some common workflows that pop up for things like user stories. And so here's what I've observed over time. Now, I'm not a humongous burger guy, but I do like a good burger and fries. And so I thought, as a metaphor here, this might help some people out with sort of thinking through, what does this look like? What are some options for workflow? And so we're going to hang out here for just a few minutes to kind of walk through this. One in particular, which is a very, very common one, which is to do doing block and done. And what that means is you're going to have any kind of work go through, hey, we need to work on it, to we're working on it, to oops, it's blocked or delayed, to then it's done. And sometimes groups of individuals will take that work in the block column, move it back into doing, and then mark it as done. Sometimes they remove it completely off the board and they don't show it as anything that's blocked, and then they bring it back on the board. Those are typical behaviors of people just trying to track their work, right, in their workflow. You move on beyond that and you get things like to do, dev, QA, and done. And I put the cheese on the hamburger to represent QA, right? It's extra good stuff to have. Some groups actually have a backlog. They have a dev, they have a QA, and they have a release. Not uncommon to see that. In fact, when I've worked with different areas, release is often a key activity because it's shared among different individuals, different groups, not just a single team. Not that that shouldn't be the case, but that's kind of what I see from time to time. Now you get a little bit more advanced and you get into things like backlog, dev, QA, release ready, release done. The reason they're tracking this is to indicate more or less when something is ready versus when something is done. So you can see there in release ready versus released, that's a state indicator. That tells us we're ready for it and we've done it basically. And there may be still things to do after we're done with the release, some documentation things, other things like that. It depends again on your environment. It may or may not fit for you. And by the way, these are not recommendations that I make on behalf of Combine University. These are just some interesting things I've seen as far as workflow and how people play with it. You can see here on the next one, backlog, BA, dev, QA, release ready, released, done. This has a little bit more analysis built into it, along with the other goodies that we saw here. The analysis is the chicken nuggets, for example. And then on the far right here, we've got the same list, but we also have what we call customer feedback. That's the dessert piece. That's the good part that really comes out of this, which is really trying to get that feedback in. That's super important to say, are we going in the right direction? That could be your customer that's internal within your organization, or it could be your customer that's actually your paying customer. So it doesn't matter how you look at this in terms of the customer feedback as whether or not it's internal or external, but getting that feedback is really valuable to tell you that you're building the right stuff. I imagine a lot of you get that customer feedback, and some of you would long for that customer feedback. I've worked both in commercial and government spaces, and it's 50-50, honestly. Sometimes the government will give you great feedback, sometimes they won't. Same with commercial. So in terms of exploring, remember we talked earlier about exploring and discovering things. That's what we're looking at here with the workflow. So not all work follows the same workflow is kind of the magic trick here. What I showed you earlier, going back here just for a second, that assumes that every piece of work will follow the same columns or the same dominant activities there in the bullet points. That's not reality for a lot of pieces of work. So when you start to mix work together, you'll find that some things don't need QA, or some things don't need to go through a release cycle because they're just dynamic in that way. And that's okay. But not tracking that is where it gets to be really tricky to figure out where's the opportunity for improvement in a lot of cases. So when we're looking at workflow, what we're looking for are trying to reveal some of that delay, some of that disruption, some of that dependency type things that can really help you out in terms of improving your workflow. So this is something to be thinking about here as we play with workflow. Now I'm going to show you an example of what a sort of unique workflow can be for work types. Now work types, again, user stories, they could be spikes, they could be bugs, they could be features. Whatever you got in your environment is your reality. So you want to honor that and kind of build out a workflow against those things. And that's what we talk about a lot in terms of improvement. So here's an example of what that looks like. And this is just from a simplistic view of Scrum, by the way. Your Scrum might be different. That's okay to me as far as how we look at things. We are big on the idea of starting with what you do now and then applying evolutionary change concepts to that. And that's a key thing to be thinking about here. So in this case, we just provided, you guys can see here, 3 different types of workflows according to a type of work, right? And we call those work item types in the Kanban space, but really just they're types of work ultimately. And so you can see here, we've got bugs, user stories, and spikes. And some of you might be doing spikes. Some of you might not be doing spikes. That's okay. It's a matter of what you've got in your environment. But we have 3 things here. The bugs, for example, we're going to confirm that they exist. We're going to try and develop a fix for it. We're going to do a quick rapid test and deploy that fix as fast as possible. In fact, I've seen some of that lately in the software development world. I'm not going to name names, but I'm watching some product hits and quick updates. They rolled out new versions of their products. So that's common to have happen sometimes. You got to move quickly. And that doesn't require the same diligence maybe as a user story. So user story is a little different, right? We all hopefully know what user stories are, but you're going to write one probably, design a solution against that user story, maybe 2 or 3 possibly, develop the solution, test it, and then deploy it. So there's a lot of work there that goes on in the background to make that come together. The last one is a spike, right? We don't know quite what we're building yet. We're kind of figuring things out. We need to go out and test some things out, prototype some things, feel it out technically. So we're going to design a potential experiment or a spike in this case, go out and execute it, and then see what it teaches us, see what it's helping us to learn about what we want to do. So kind of a learning activity, a learning loop in that case. But these actually follow this 3 different workflows, and they can all be on the same board, by the way. So that's something that we commonly do. We aggregate these things together into one visualization, but we acknowledge that some things don't follow the same workflow. So for example, spikes might have design, execute, review, and learn, but you'll notice they don't have a test. So in this case, they don't have to have a test activity. When we're visualizing this, we might say, here's the design column, here's the develop or execute column, and then here's the test column. But when we do this in terms of visualization, we might indicate that we have a row, possibly on a board, for bugs, a row for user stories, a row for spikes. And when you visualize that, that's where you might see the spikes just, they don't hang out in the test column at all. There's a test column for them, but everyone knows we don't test a spike, we just do it, and then we learn from it. So that's another thing to be thinking about here, is that even though it may show up on a visualization, you don't have to follow it necessarily because it doesn't have that workflow attached to it. You guys might be asking, why in the heck would we ever do this? Well, because it starts to show you information around how long things are hanging out in a given column. That tells you where work is spending the most time. There's quite likely a story there to understand. So some of you may have done this kind of analysis, know it well. Some of you may not know it at all. So if you're new to this, welcome aboard to kind of playing with your data from your Kanban systems or Kanban boards. So in this case, you might find that there is quite a bit of time spent in execution or development in terms of how you look at these labels. And you start to say, well, what's going on here? Why is it taking so much time? And as you dig into that, you might discover some easy ways to improve your environment. An example I had from the field where I've worked before, it comes from the testing column, actually. Testing environments sometimes are not reliable. They're sometimes not up and running. These are sometimes mainframe environments, by the way. So if you're looking in the DevOps space, you probably don't have a test column issue. I don't know, but you might not. Whereas in the mainframe space, sometimes the environments aren't that reliable. And if that's the case, then you can say, wait, how do we improve that environment reliability? So while it's not primary to the work, it's secondary in terms of the environment being stable. It's still a great way to improve your environment overall. And it may not take that much effort to improve it. But this quantifies it in such a way that when you bring it to management, to other team members, everyone goes, oh yeah, that's an easy problem. Let's solve that one first. So this helps to discover a little bit more about what to improve. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about how that actually happens. So there's the quantifying bit, and there's also kind of the qualitative bit, which I think is super important to understand. So in terms of qualitative stuff, you're working with your team, working with individuals. You're trying to discover what is it that we need to do to improve. And you've probably got a great set of people working with you. Your fellow developers or your team involved with you, you're going to actually have that information sitting right out in front of you. So that's what I call on the ground in terms of low-hanging fruit. It's already fallen off the tree. People are like, oh, if only could we fix this? Can you please help me with this? And that's going to be stuff that's sitting out there as vocalized, verbalized, written down pain, maybe in your Slack system, maybe in email. If you're co-located and you're actually working in the office, maybe it's a coffee chat where people go, I really wish we could fix this. So that pain sitting there is pretty evident. And then there's the other end of this picture, which is basically looking at that data like I was talking about, kind of exploring and poking around where you're finding your delays. So I know in some organizations, this can be tricky stuff, by the way. I've worked with some organizations that have really strict policies that if you run into a delay, it goes up to the CTO. And I understand that that's tricky stuff. So you might actually reverse out your delay information by looking at the numbers of, like we were talking about, how long it takes the work to get done in a given column of work. So we're going to talk about that now. When it comes to on the ground, this is an example of what we've seen in the field before. And I'll cover these briefly with you guys so you can kind of get an idea. And this is primarily coming from research in the Scrum space. So please understand, this is not my words. This is almost literally what people have said to us. But for example, pressure to deliver the sprint while also dealing with everything else that's work. So in Canada, I love this phrase. They call it side of desk work. So I'm doing my main job, and then on the side of my desk, someone drops off something else. Nowadays, virtually, that could be like your Slack system, your chat system, Microsoft Teams, whatever it might be. But they are actually saying, hey, could you help out with this? Can you help out with that? So it's actually attacking your focus little by little. Another one is general managers, project managers want more done, and they keep putting stuff into the backlog. Pretty common problem that we see happen where there's a desire to get more done. They believe if they do more, they'll get more value out to the customer. Another one is quality assurance. Now, these, by the way, are on the ground. These are things that people have voiced. I should say that clearly. This is sensed information. This isn't quantifiable information. This is what people are hearing or seeing in their environment. So they have the quality assurance bottleneck. They also have software engineers that don't want to help testers. And the testers don't trust the software engineers. I've seen that happen a few times. And the software engineers push work onto testers and expect immediate feedback. I've been there in those environments before. And then also too much testing work. So the testers either have too much work being sent out by the developers because the developers just want to get through their tasks and feel good about their progress, which means ultimately there's a ton of work that piles up for the testers. Or like I said earlier, the environment is down too much and too long. So there's no way to fully test things out. So bottlenecks start to show up around testing, for example. Not uncommon and a pain in the rear, basically, because developers are sitting there going, we need more work to do. And they're getting more work, but then the work that they complete is piling up for the testers. Big problem there. So the flip side of this is using your Kanban visualization or the information coming from your Kanban board to tell you more. So you'll notice here on the right, there is a very kind of what might be robust for you board layout here on the right side. You got like design, create, review, deliver. This is like, for example, a training backlog or a training program where they're designing, creating, and reviewing training products. It could also be for software development to some degree. Don't worry too much about the columns here as far as the labels. It's more representative of what you've got in your environment, by the way. So if you were to go to like a Kanban system design class, you'd understand that this is pretty much mapping what you've got right now. This is just a theoretical example, but you'll notice that in these columns, you've got doing and done, and you've also got the backlog on the left, and you've got deliver on the right. This is to help illustrate how the work is flowing through the environment. Now you'll notice there that there are three different kind of icons right there. There's a help icon, there's what's like a stop sign, and a bug icon. Those are all visual indicators that something is weird here, that something's going on that we need to investigate. That means in the review column, there's probably a qualitative issue here. We need to fix that. In the create column, it means we're stuck. We can't move forward. We're waiting on somebody to help us out. And in the design column, we need help locally inside the environment. There's probably something going on. And you'll see on the right side here, there's also some columns, some stickies that indicate what's going on. So the defect, for example, failed a smoke test, dependency, waiting on Stacy. And you can see how we have defect, dependency, derailed. Those are common types of delays that we see happening in the environment. So the quality's not right, we're waiting on somebody else, or someone has basically said, no, we're not going to continue doing this. Those are examples of what you might run into that are really kind of quantitative. They're sitting right there in front of you. And that comes from tracking that visually, which means from your side of the fence, you want to be able to get that kind of information from people. You have to have them actually collaborate with you and put that on their Kanban board. That can be kind of hard to do, honestly, in terms of human behavior. And we're going to kind of pick apart how you actually can maybe make that happen here in a second. But these pains are really interesting because what you can do is start to quantify them. So you'll notice on the previous slide here, we talked about sort of on the ground things, and that sort of individual attention and individual voice. Typically what I do in those scenarios is I kind of cluster them together where they make sense, where they have commonality, and then I have people vote on those things saying, hey, which of those things do you want to try to address now? So it becomes sort of an affinity type mapping activity. So you've got that sort of thing going on there for on the ground. And then when it comes to ready to be picked, you kind of have data staring right in front of you. So frequency is kind of your friend at this point. You'll notice how we have three dependencies there. Those probably all say, wait a minute, we're waiting on Stacy twice, we're waiting on Ted once. Maybe we ought to try and help out working with Stacy, see if we can actually help her flow a bit better, or reserve some space and time for us on her calendar, or something else like that. That allows that work to go through a little bit more smoothly. So how you handle this information is going to be interesting because it can come in two different forms, right? It comes from your group of people that you're working with, but also can come from this board that's sitting right in front of you. Now, when it comes to actually checking it out and saying what's worth doing, that's the next step that's really fun to me. That's where this gets to be really interesting because collecting the information is kind of fun, but knowing how to sort of sort through it is superbly fun. So we have really 4 different categories of kind of like influence on the problem. So you'll notice earlier we had like problems over here. Let's just grab one over here, Stacy, for example. So we're waiting on Stacy. Stacy's a human being. Stacy has a lot going on in their lives. So we don't know quite what will happen here if we approach Stacy and say, hey, can you help us out? But we're going to assess how easy it is to actually influence that situation, that problem. So Stacy probably is doing something that we really need a lot of help with. They're the expert in whatever this thing is. And now we want to say, how do we get Stacy to move in our direction a bit? How do we get Stacy to reserve some time in their calendar to help us out? And we've got really 4 different ways of looking at this. And this is more like a scale of rating, basically how much we can influence the problem associated with what Stacy's working on. So Stacy's not the problem necessarily. I should make that clear. It could be that simply Stacy's availability, her calendar, whatever it is, she's not available as much as we need her to be for what we're doing. So planning ahead maybe is the solution with her. But the question is, can we even reach Stacy? You know, you guys, some of you are working internationally. Sometimes that's hard to do, to get on their calendar to talk with them, even about changing how they might operate a little bit. So you have to figure out, how can you influence this? Are you the right person to influence it? So you'll notice here, we've got, yes, we can influence this problem without a doubt. It's a local problem to what we do perhaps, or somewhere within our reach. We can make this change happen quickly. But on the flip side is, the other end of this is, no, we're not sure. We don't know, or not really. So in this case, not really is the hard problem. This is where it's going to take a lot of effort to influence this. It could be that Stacy always says, go to my manager if you want to talk to me. And that manager is trying to protect Stacy, and they're making it even harder to collaborate with them. So, you know, at that point, you can't really influence that, for example, dependency that's coming from Stacy and what we need from her or him. So the trick here is trying to figure out how to make sure that we know we can influence it. So maybe the problem with Stacy is not the best problem to solve. The team might say, oh, that's so easy. That looks so fun. And that looks like the right one to solve because it's the biggest problem we got. But the reality is you can't influence it. So it becomes a bit of a headache trying to move that rock forward, so to speak. And that rock could be Stacy's availability. It could be what the manager is saying Stacy should work on. It just depends on that environment that you're in. But the idea here is you're going to rate these things collaboratively with a group of people, with your team that's involved in trying to make this change happen. So you don't do it on your own. You could if you wanted to, if you need to. Doesn't hurt to try, but really it's going to get a lot more power if everyone agrees, yes, we can do this. We can actually move forward and try and experiment here with something that might actually solve this problem. So if I go back to like the other board here, the on the ground board, you'll see that there's pressure to deliver the sprint while dealing with everything else that's work related. That may be one where everyone goes, yeah, we can actually influence that because that's our local problem. That's in our space. We can work on trying to mitigate how much work we do that's not dedicated to the sprint. And I know a lot of people who love Scrum and love sprinting want to try and keep that sprint clean. More power to you if you can do it. We do see a lot of people who struggle with that. And so one of the solutions we have is to actually say, well, you know, and some Scrum people actually say this too, is to kind of reduce your batch size and make a little bit of room for this unplanned work that's showing up in your environment. In the Kanban space, we kind of want to visualize that sometimes. We have one lane that's dedicated to the sprint across the board, and then one lane that's dedicated to the, you know, everything else that's work kind of stuff that shows up. Typically, I call that unplanned work. We didn't plan on it. Now it's here. We got to deal with it somehow because it's going to create too many problems if we don't. So we try to pull that work through in some form. So back over here to this rating system, again, we're trying to rate, can we influence that change? So that unplanned work that's falling on our plates, yes, we can totally deal with that. We can probably address that in some form, like we said, visually. So we think we can, by the way, guys. So, and ladies, this is a key thing. We don't know if this is going to work. And that's the key thing here when it comes to experimentation. So you're proposing an experiment. Hey guys, we're going to create this visualization where we have unplanned work going across our board, planned work, our sprint work going across the board. And we think that's going to create balance for us. That's the hypothesis, more or less. But we don't know, right? We don't know if this is going to work for sure. Everyone believes positively that it will. But the idea is to see if you can actually nudge something in the right direction. That may mean that you have to nudge more than just doing the board layout. A nudge to me or a change is something that's small that can be tested out without creating a huge amount of impact. A simple one might be, before you create the visualization, can we get everyone to agree that that's unplanned work, and then see if we can start to solve that problem. So typically, the problem that comes at the team or the team identifies, and the solution is usually very large. And what you want to do is kind of bring those things down to smaller steps to effectively test things out along the way to see if you're going in the right direction. So the hypothesis here, let's create a swim lane, might result in 4 or 5 steps. One step might be, let's talk with people to make sure that they're okay with us doing this, that they understand that the work will go there. And it won't hang out in Slack or Teams or whatever. We're going to actually put it visually on the board if you're going to ask us to do something, so that everyone knows we're trying to be accountable for how much we're committing to overall, even within a 2-week period or a 1-week period. We're committing to things that we didn't say yes to at the beginning of a plan, but now we're in flight with a plan and we have other things to do. So you want to check basically and start to build that kind of collaborative rapport in developing effectively a change that takes place over time. It could take 4 weeks, 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks to fully pull in and make this happen in a way that no one feels like they're going to refuse it. So keep that in mind. As much as your brain moves so fast logically to do things, people sense and respond. They sense things out emotionally. They're going to take their time going through introducing and accepting a change. And one last thing to kind of plug here, I'll share a little bit more in a second, is we have a bunch of practices that we think are pretty darn effective in a lot of cases. Doesn't mean they're always effective, but they are great to try out as potential solutions for your experiments. So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but just keep in mind that in most cases, you'll feel confident. That's your bias kicking in saying, oh, we're gonna nail this, we're gonna do this just right. And the reality is you don't know, and that's okay. You're gonna learn. That's the exciting part here. And here's what this looks like for a quality assurance bottleneck. So earlier I was telling you guys about how this works, right? How you actually lay out a column that may have QA stuff in it. And that column gets pounded with tons of work because the developers are simply saying, let's go, let's go, let's go. They love to get that development work done. Feels good to go home at the end of the day and say, I wrote some things that have compiled and now they're ready to be tested. But the problem is that's creating a bottleneck for QA because they're simply not able to keep up. Maybe they have a problem with their environment of running QA tests. We don't know yet, but we know there's a bottleneck there. And so in dialogue and discussion with the team and ideating on what we can do to solve that problem, we came up with the 4 possible experiments, basically. Expand the workflow to show what QA is actually focusing on. So in this case, there may be just a QA column that's sitting there on the board right now, and we don't know if it's active or done yet. It's hard to see that visually. So our first step is going to be break that down. Let's create one column for doing, one column for done underneath the QA column. Excellent. Now we can see what they're working on and what they say they're done with. That tells us a lot more about what's going on in their environment. And we're also going to bring this up during the retros. This is going to be something we just continually talk about until we feel like we've got it somewhat managed. So in terms of bottleneck, there are things called elevating constraints, POOGI. That's another good way to look at this, to say, how do we actually balance out the amount of work going through the QA environment? And that may be coming through some of the metrics as well. So the metrics will tell you how long the work is taking, what does that look like, and is there certain types of work, like we talked about earlier, user stories versus bugs versus features? Maybe those go through a different kind of life cycle inside the QA column. And the more we understand that, the more we can understand how much should be going into that column. Such that, for example, if a developer's done with work, it doesn't just simply go into the QA column and people say we're committed to it. They say, wait, we're actually trying to finish a feature and 2 or 3 stories, and that's enough for us right now. When we finish 1 or 2 more stories, then we can decide if we're going to bring in 1 or 2 more stories or a feature. That's going to be a healthier balance to try and get things flowing through that QA bottleneck a bit better. That's an example of the metrics piece. And then also the WIP, right? So this is monitoring the work in progress. It's not setting a limit. It's actually saying, what do we have? So using that visualization, using those metrics and talking about it can help you inform yourselves as to how much is the QA team really committing to. Because sometimes the QA folks might be overcommitting themselves by saying, okay, I'll throw this test and this test and this test and this test. And I've been there before testing my own software. I've seen that happen where I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I'm doing too much. I'm overcommitting. So you want to be able to say, let's monitor this for now. Do what you normally do, and then let's see if we can change that behavior if we need to change that behavior. So one of the things that can happen sometimes in experimentation is that people tend to run to solutions too fast. And they think, well, this is the right answer. Here's a new policy, QA, go do it. And we're pretty big believers in what's called the OODA loop in the Kanban space. That means observe, orient, decide, and act. Observe and orient is a key activity that some people kind of go through pretty quickly. And that's where you have to hang out a little bit more to understand what's really taking place before making a change necessarily. That's why over here we say 2 to 3 sprints. It may take that long to see how is this system really evolving? How is it operating? Now, you may already have that data in front of you. Kudos. If you got that, go ahead and proceed with what you think it might be the right decision, the right action to make there. So that is the key thing to be thinking about here, is time and understanding the problem. So that's a little bit of the experiment activity. That may seem like that's it. I hate to tell you guys, there's a little bit more to it than just what we just showed you here. So when it comes to evolutionary change, there's one more thing that I like to call variability or reality, and that strikes and bites. What that means is, effectively, that even though you've put together this beautiful plan, you've developed this discipline for experimentation, you've broken your ideas down into smaller steps, and now you're coming out with effectively a change that you're rolling out. Remember that things happen around your environment. I think most of you probably get this. Some of you who are new to this field of work and trying to put your feet on the ground, this is the hardest part to deal with. It's the unknown, what I like to call quantum leaps. There used to be a TV show on back in the day that had this one main character that would get things just right in a given timeline of history. And as soon as they fixed the timeline, they would vaporize and go into a new problem space. And I kind of think that's the reality here for a lot of the work that we do. We're trying to run an experiment under somewhat understood environmental variables, and then those variables change without our control. An example of this, which commonly happens these days, probably will happen this month. Yeah, we're in December now, is probably some of you will be going through a reorganization now or next month is my guess. And that's not uncommon to see happen. But when that happens, that effectively breaks up a lot of what you may be doing. May changes your team, maybe changes the work that you're doing. I don't know, but that's a reality for you. So just keep that in mind. Don't give up hope that this will work, because it does. But it sometimes, you have things come at you from left and right that you can't predict for. And those are what we call stressors in our environment. So let's talk about that a little bit more now, and then I'll wrap up for Q&A. So we have this thing called the evolutionary change formula. That's what I just showed you effectively. And it starts with basically understanding the stress. So like I just talked about, you sometimes have unplanned stressors that hit you. Sometimes you have recurring stressors that fall on your plate over and over and over again. That's sensed by your team, responded to hopefully by your team if it's something they can change. But it also can be coming from the metrics, from the data side of your Kanban visualizations. That's really fun stuff to play with, honestly. The next step is really understanding what the solution might be. So designing some experiments like we just talked about. That's a great place to start next, is to say, what can we do and when can we do it and when does it make sense? And the last piece is, who is going to help out with this? It can't be just you. So if you're a coach here listening on this call, this webinar, realize that it's not up to you alone. I think you probably get that. But the key thing here is that other people involved in this work really need to help out. It could be that the QA person's really good friends with the person who does the upstream planning stuff. Great, let's talk with them and have them actually discuss how we might actually have a new policy put in place that makes the upstream run smoother, the backlog perhaps. So these are things that typically happen when you're introducing a change in your environment and you're testing it out. The idea behind evolution is effectively you're going to try it. It may work, it may help out, or it may be a complete stinker, right? It may be the worst idea ever. Like that swim lane for the unplanned work may not work in your environment, and you learn a lot about that. That's the key value of evolutionary change. It's not necessarily making change happen effectively and immediately and stick forever. It's saying we think this will work and improve our capability, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And that learning and that loop around learning is the key value here. So keep that in mind. It's nonlinear work in a lot of cases. Some things won't go as planned. Some things will need to stop. Some things, like I said, might need to be rolled back. I tried to do test-driven development years ago, failed horribly 4 or 5 times, and then figured out how to maybe make it work in my environment. And again, it's the looping piece, the teaching piece is going to be super important around experimenting and doing evolutionary change. 2 final things for you guys before we drop into Q&A sessions here. Really strengthening your evolution. So getting better at how you evolve is another key thing. Knowing the options that are out there, the ideas that could help you out, and sort of solving your problems. That's where our Kanban practices really kick into gear. So we've got 6 practices out there. You probably see the one on the right, which is the most important one: improve collaboratively, evolve experimentally. Most people jump to number 1 over there. And by the way, these are not in order, in particular order. That's just how they got put together years ago. But visualization is what people tend to run to pretty quickly. And if you read some guides out there, they say, oh, visualize, limit, whip, manage flow, all of these in order. I don't recommend you do that, actually. I recommend you pick up the far right one, figure out how to collaborate well, figure out how to evolve experimentally. And now you've got your whole group of individuals helping to figure out what are the best options there for how to improve, and do it through an evolutionary change approach. And you'll see there from the left side beyond, establish feedback loops. You may already have your retrospectives. That's great. You may have a few other opportunities here for how to improve those things. Making policies explicit. So instead of saying we might want to do this, let's try and see if we can really stick to this thing. That teaches you a lot about how you're actually aspiring versus really delivering on things. Managing your flow, getting rid of those blockers, those delays, those dependencies like we talked about, making sure things are a bit more predictable over time. Limiting how much you do is probably the hardest thing to do, honestly, but it is one of the more interesting things to play with. And if you're curious about that, feel free to reach out to me. I've got my email here at the end of this. There's a really interesting technique that one of our accredited Kanban consultants did recently, where he said, look at throughput, don't look at WIP limits. He said, basically manage your throughput to get your WIP limit in place. That's super interesting as a technique for introducing it without creating resistance from people to say we're going to limit how much we do. So something to think about there. And visualization, people know that fairly well, but there's a lot more to visualization out there that we teach people. And that's from our practices body of knowledge. And this is always evolving, by the way. So these are pragmatic things that we've seen work in the field, but they're also things that maybe you don't know about that could actually help you quickly find some solutions to the problems that you're experiencing right now. But practice this, right? Get confident in doing it. Don't worry about doing it right the first time. It's more about getting those muscles going for how to improve. So we don't have people here who can actually give us a comment or a thumbs up, it looks like. So in the back of your head, as you're looking through this, think about this. And you can do Q&A, you can do chat, or you don't have to do anything at all. But just to reflect on this, think about this activity, right? The actual evolutionary change piece, collecting that feedback and making some decisions off of it and figuring out what to do. Could you actually do that, right? Can you consider doing this? Because in cultures of teams and environments that you work in, that can be pretty hard to do sometimes, to even have that conversation. And if you're already doing it, kudos to you. Love to talk with you. Always willing to learn from other people because a lot of people are getting great things done here. And also just kind of in your brain, think about, if it worked, that's a key thing. So are you able to have this conversation? Are you able to provide some kind of solution around the problem that you're experiencing using something like an evolutionary change approach? And then if it worked, give yourself a pat on the back, go eat some chocolate if you like chocolate today, because that's amazing work. If you're still kind of struggling there, that's where we can help you guys out quite a bit more. This was a very short, very quick deep dive into some of these things that we do in the Kanban method space around evolutionary change. So if you have your camera available right now and you take a quick picture, one of the things that we have here is this official guide to the Kanban method. You may have read it, you may have not read it. If you haven't read it, feel free to grab it. It's a free download for you to grab. Also with this is what I consider to be a management-friendly book or dialogue. So years ago, I had a CIO sit in an elevator with me and said, "What's Kanban?" I said, "Well, let me give you a book on it." And that was a mistake. But this is probably the closest thing I would do to give them a visual representation of what this is. It's a short read. It's a quick read. Great for managers, great for executives to some degree to understand what's going on underneath the hood when we talk about this sort of Kanban stuff, especially around evolutionary change. So that's it. Last little bit here for you guys. If you want to know more about how to play with evolutionary change, how to add it to your Scrum environment, this is the link to our course for how we do that, and love to hear more about it from your perspectives. Now I'm ready for the Q&A side of things. So I don't know if my hosts want to open up the Q&A conversations, or if you guys just want to unmute yourselves, however you want to do it. Let's go into Q&A. And thank you.
The Q&A panel is available. So anybody has got any questions, you can post them there.
And any questions open, by the way, it doesn't have to be about evolutionary change. Any kind of Kanban question. All right. Give you guys another second or two here to think through something. If you want to ask, you're welcome to.
Yes, while we wait for Q&A, Joey, I would like to ask a question. Yep.
Yeah.
There is one from Snehal, I think. Yeah, she has typed in the chat itself. Okay, let's go to Snehal and then I'll come back.
Okay. Yeah, so I see that question, Snehal. It looks like, how to gain confidence from the team for experiments. One of the things I've learned over the years is to kind of be humble about it. So what can happen is that you might step into the situation saying, I'm going to be confidently lead you through that. This is more about collaborative, collective exploration and discussion around problems. So when it comes to confidence, really it is the confidence to admit when there's stress, or confidence to admit when there's challenge in front of you and start to talk about that effectively. So having a good conversation isn't necessarily tied to having a good solution. It's about being comfortable coming up with solutions, comfortable with saying, I don't know, and comfortable with saying, let's give it a try and see what happens. And then from that, actually being comfortable and confident to say, I can handle negative information. I can handle potentially bad outcomes from this experiment, and that's okay. So that's a key thing for me a lot of times in working with individuals and teams to say, that's okay. You know what? If it blew up, that's all right. We can deal with it. I think where people lose confidence is when leaders or coaches or individuals on the team start to negatively react to that kind of information coming back from an experiment, thinking, oh, we shouldn't do this anymore. The fact is, that's your brain saying, no, I don't like this information. The reality is, that's information. It's not fact. You can work with that information now and do something with it.
I think
Thank you so
Kalyan
much.
had posted a
I
question.
posted a quick question,
Yeah.
a generic question that's being asked at many places, right? So the difference between evolutionary or other approaches that are there. So do you want to take a minute or two just to, explain what are your thoughts and how would you put it across to people when?
Yeah, I do have a quick answer for this one, Kalyan, because it recently came up internally in product development. I think we have a pretty good answer for this. So I don't think Scrum is a revolutionary whatsoever. I mean, people might think of it that way, totally cool with them. But my approach is actually to say that Scrum is an empirical approach. Really good at saying, let's try this, it worked or it didn't work. Totally love that. How do you manage that empirical work? How do you actually manage the overall environment that Scrum operates in? That's where I think the Kanban's evolutionary approach pays off a few more dividends in terms of actually using it. So it helps you to manage a framework, maybe even fill in the gaps in a framework. That's kind of how I see that sort of evolutionary approach along with Scrum, really. It's a complementary thing, not necessarily a reactionary thing where they have to fight against each other. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
what do you
great
Sneha?
question.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Joy. That was great. Thank you for answering all the questions. And it was a wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. You guys have a great day.
Yeah.
You too. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining, Joe. Bye.